What's going on, folks, and welcome back to Stu's Garage. First off, for the folks following along on this video, I guess you're probably asking yourselves why I'm not dropping the motor in, because I know I said that I'd be doing that on the next video. Well, I got ahead of myself a little bit. Trust me, I'm not dragging this thing out. Nobody wants that motor into this bay more than I do, but I have a slight holdup. So if you guys remember in the last video, I upgraded to a larger set of brake calipers, and I decided to just go ahead and do things correct, and I ordered the larger master cylinder to go with that as well. And this master cylinder will support larger brakes in the future if I do go that route, but it's also a good match for the ones that I have on there now. But more information on that on the next video, because on the next video we'll be installing that. We just have to wait because there's one more piece that I need for it, and I don't want to be the poor bastard that has to install a brake master cylinder with the engine in the way. So that's why I'm waiting to install the motor till after I have that master cylinder in there. In the meantime, I do have a little bit of stuff to keep me busy, a lot of small stuff that I'm not really necessarily going to put on camera. But as far as today, we're going to be putting in a couple of gauges that I need, and I'll show you those in just a second. So today we're going to be installing a new water temperature gauge. We're going to be installing a fuel gauge, and somewhere around here I've got a voltage gauge, but that's not really super important at this time. But anyways, I'll be putting in a fuel gauge because as some of you guys may know, I switched my dash over to a Bluetooth dash to go with my custom ECU, and I no longer have the fuel gauge. I didn't realize it. The new dash has everything on it except for a fuel gauge. The new digital dash also has a temperature gauge, but if something should go wrong with that and I don't have that, I still need to be able to tell what my temperature is, because it's very important if you're driving something that's not stock. So I don't want to have to overheat my car just because my gauges went out or the Bluetooth didn't find a connection or something stupid happened to the Android tablet. So I'm going to need to have this gauge. Also in the car is the Afr gauge. That's very useful if you're tuning, or if if you have a boosted car, which I don't have, but the Afr gauge is currently in there. So we're going to be putting these gauges in, and that's going to be that. This is going to apply to you whether you have an LS engine, a 302 engine, a 4-cylinder engine. If you drive a Honda, it's pretty much going to be the same kind of install for anything that you're running. Of course, we're doing it today on the soon-to-be LS-powered Fox. So, what we're going to do for this install is I'm actually going to go ahead and pull the dashboard out of here again. You won't need to do that if you have a Foxbody, because the dash cluster actually comes apart independently. And if you have a custom piece that you want to put in there or whatever, you can actually take that piece off without removing the whole dash. As for me with the custom dash, it's actually pretty easy for me to pull this unit out of here, so that's not going to be a big deal. As you can see, I've got this slot here, and you may have slots down here. You can pretty make space for new gauges anywhere you decide to do in your dash. All you have to do is just cut out a mounting plate for them. You can make that out of spare plastic, paper, cardboard, whatever you choose to make it out of, and you can do it that way. So let me go ahead and get this dash out of here, and then we'll get moving on this. Alright, so we've got the dashboard back outside of the car. This is the plate that I made. It's just made out of some thick plastic that I had, and this actually sits behind this section here, and that's what I'll be mounting my gauges to. So you could either do something like this, or like I said, you could make yourself a plate here out of aluminum or plastic or cardboard or whatever you decide to use, or you could get creative like what I'm going to do over here. So since I have two gauges to install, my Afr gauge is already here, and the tablet is actually going to be taking up this area here. I have a space here for a gauge. So what I'm going to end up doing is putting my fuel gauge right here. That way I can still see it when my tablet is on, and I'm actually going to take this and try to drill this out so that I can fit my temp gauge there. And the reason I'm doing it here is just pretty much because it'll look cooler and cleaner. And this was the light switch for the BMW. The Foxbody light switches are here, So I don't want loose switches that don't do anything in the car, because that's just tacky to me. So I took the light switch out, and I'm going to try and drill out this hole so that I can actually fit one of those gauges in there, and it's going to look really cool. So in order to make these holes, you're going to need the correct size hole saw, which this one worked out pretty well for this. It's the same size for the back of it. So we're going to go ahead and as you can see the outline here, you won't actually see this when this is installed. I just went ahead and did this to see where the edges of the outside are on here. That way I wouldn't put the gauge on the outside of the edges and have interference with my fitment. Alright, fast forwarding a little bit, we got our hole drilled out, and it's almost a perfect fit. It's a little bit loose for the fuel gauge, but what I'm gonna do to fix that is just wrap it with a little bit of this old cheap electrical tape. This isn't a cheap one, but I have some cheap electrical tape around that I don't use for anything, so I'm just gonna wrap it up with that and make it a little bit tighter fit. Alright, now we've got enough tape on here to get a nice tight fit, and we're gonna go ahead and pop this thing in there like so. Alright, and now we've got it in there. It's actually tight enough to where I don't actually have to do anything, but we're gonna go ahead and take the supplied hardware and secure it down the way that it's meant to be secured using this little bracket here. Alright, and I'm holding this thing in here with my hand, but this is about what the gauges are going to look like once they're installed. I want to skip back a little bit. You need, in order to get a fuel gauge for your car, you're going to need to get one that matches the correct ohms, I believe, of resistance for your fuel sending unit. And good luck trying to figure that out. The easiest thing to do is, if you're a Mustang owner, just go on latemodelrestoration.com and buy the one that they recommend. Otherwise, if you're going to go on websites and try to figure out what ohms match up, that may work out for you if you go to respectable websites. If you order the stuff off of eBay that says that it's going to work, good luck. You wouldn't want to do all of this work and drilling and everything and fitting and wiring just to find out that it doesn't work. So I think I spent about $50 on this gauge, and for me it's worth it. Even though I usually buy the cheap stuff, it's worth it just knowing in peace of mind that this is going to work, and I'm not going to end up on the side of the road somewhere thinking I have a half tank of gas when it's really on zero. Alright, so I got my hole drilled in here, which was actually surprisingly difficult to do, but I'll show you guys how I did it, but I know nobody cares. So anyways, this piece is going to slide into here like so. I may add some electrical tape to that one as well, just to make it fit a little bit tighter, but this one's going to be held on by a little threaded ring, and that's just going to tighten down on there just like that, and that sits in there. Alright, and the last thing I did is I went ahead and drilled a hole right here for the voltage meter, which is right here. This is just a little cheap eBay voltage gauge. This thing is like $4 or $5 on eBay, and it's going to do the job just fine. And I'd prefer not for this thing to be front and center the way I have it, but I think it's probably still the best position for it. And it will be covered once my digital gauge cluster is on there, which is going to still have voltage on it. But the purpose of all of these gauges, except for the fuel gauge, is basically backups, so I can get in, I can move the car, I can drive it around, just in case something happens to the tablet and I don't have all of my readings. I can still have the most important things like voltage, fuel, and temperature. So that's how the panel is going to look. This is how everything is going to line up. And next up, we're going to be wiring everything up. I really like how this looks. This came out really cool. Alright, so now we've got everything wired up and ready to go. I used the wiring guide here for a reference, but for the most part, these gauges pretty much wire up almost exactly the same. Even though one's from Autometer and one is from Equus, they wire up about the same. So in most cases, most gauges are going to wire up the same way. As you can see here, this black plug at the top, which they both have, that's going to be an LED light or a little light bulb. And you can wire these separate. So as you can see, there's a black wire and a white wire coming out of it. You can wire these separate so that you can have your gauge light come on when you turn your headlights on, the way that, you know, a lot of people would normally wire your gauge lights. I just have everything wired together for power because I want it all to come on at the same time. The gauge is going to get power at the same time the light gets power. I don't really care about them turning on separately. So anyways, what I've done, and you can choose how to do it. So like I said, you would normally put the white wire going to your headlights or whatever, or your headlight switch. Anyways, what I've done is I've taken the light bulb and I've tied it to the actual power for the gauge, and I have that coming down to one power wire, and I actually have a switch that powers my whole dashboard. For you would put this to your 12-volt keyed ignition source, but I've wired my whole car a little bit differently, so that's that. Next up, we have the grounds, and it doesn't matter how you do these as long as they find their way to ground. So the ground plug on the light bulb and the ground plug for the gauge, they're also wired together, and they're gonna go to a ground slot which I've made in the car. Everything I ground inside the car actually comes to this bus here, and that's my little ground plate that just makes things really easy for me so I don't have to drill holes all over the place like I was doing before. Alright, I've also tied that into the ground for the voltage gauge, which the wire is coming out right here. So as you can see, 3 grounds in one. I got all 3 grounds tied together. This gauge is different because it's got its own little harness, but it's basically wired up the same way, but I can just plug this one in. Lastly, I have the red wire for the voltage gauge just hanging out. You can put this to a 12-volt ignition source as well, but I'm just gonna follow up on this one with my buddy who helps me with wiring. I may run this directly to the alternator just to help me get a more accurate reading. Lastly, and like I said, you're gonna want to follow your wiring diagram that comes in your instructions for this. On my temp gauge, the signal wire is down here at the bottom, and I've made that blue because blue makes me think of coolant. I could choose pretty much any color for this. The main thing you want to do is make sure that your power is red when you wire stuff, and make sure your ground is always black. And that's going to help you for future reference. It's going to help anybody else that comes to work on your car. You can mix and match and throw any color wires you want in there. It's not going to make a difference. But when you go back to work on things and troubleshoot and change things, if you don't know what's going to what, it's really going to hurt you in the future. So I try to always make sure that anything with power is red, even though power can come in many different colors, red, white, yellow, anything other than black. But sometimes power does come in black, but that's another story for another day if you own a BMW. But anyways, when you're wiring your own stuff, just make sure your grounds are black, make sure your power is red, and then whatever other colors you come up with for other things, just make sure you know what they are so you can follow up in the future. So anyways, over here on this side, this is our fuel gauge, and I've chosen yellow for the signal wire on here because this is actually going to tie to a yellow and white wire underneath the dash. So again, with continuity, I wanted everything to match, so I made this as close to the stock wiring as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the wires under the dash that you're going to be using in order to make this happen. Alright, so inside the car now, you're going to have two main harness plugs that goes to your gauge cluster. I have them unplugged because my gauge cluster is history. You're going to have to unplug them for this install, but you may end up plugging them back in depending on what your setup looks like. But anyways, you're gonna have a gray plug that looks like this, kind of like a little keyboard with the contacts on the outside, and you're going to have a brown plug, and what we need is this brown one. And alright, so there's wiring diagrams online, and this is how I figured this out, but the wire that we're looking for is this one right here, this yellow and white wire. It's yellow with a white line on it, and that's going to be pin number 10. There's little numbers on here that you can't see, but that's going to be pin number 10 on this brown plug. So what I'm going to do is actually just cut this wire off and attach that to my gauge because I'm never using these plugs again. But for you, you may want to actually splice into here if you're still using your factory gauges. Now over to our temperature gauge. We've got this long blue wire, and what I did is I measured to make sure that this blue wire can actually go from my dashboard location all the way over and through the firewall and my temperature sensor is actually going to be sitting on the motor right about here, so I measured out that length of wire. So the way you're going to make that happen, if you still have your stock 302, your temperature sensor for your gauge cluster is actually located right here, right in front of the intake. You can replace this one with the one that they send you, or you can actually install a temperature sensor right here in your thermostat, depending on what type of thermostat you have. This hole right here, you can drill and tap that hole. Some of you guys have one that actually has a screw in it already that you can just screw the temperature sensor into, or you can just buy the entire thermostat housing, which I've shown you in another video. So those are your two options for your temperature sensors. This one goes to your stock gauges. There's a temperature sensor right here that goes to your ECU, which you don't really worry about, and then there's the optional location right here. So on the LS, that's the other temperature sensor there. So the LS is cool because, you know, the heads are identical. On most V8s, the heads are identical. The factory ECU temperature sensor is over here, and then over on this side, you've just got a blank slot because you don't really use it. There's only one temperature sensor. So all I had to do is pop my aftermarket sensor into here. But in order to make that happen, your temperature sensor is usually going to come with a little plug that looks like this. This is your temperature probe, and this is basically the thermometer that actually takes the temperature. And these are generic fit. So in order to make these things fit inside your block, you've got to buy, hopefully it comes with it, but if it doesn't come with it, you've got to get these adapters. So you've got to find the correct adapter that goes into your block that matches the threads on your block, and then you can then take your actual sensor and you can thread that into the new hole that you have. And so that's actually how you install it, and that's what I've done over here. And the way you connect the wire is you basically just screw it right to the back of there. Alright folks, we got everything inside the car now. We got the fuel gauge over there, the AFR gauge, which we didn't cover, and the voltage gauge, and the temp gauge. So that's what the finished product is looking like for this project. And I know the layout is a little bit ugly, but just remember, for me, these are backup gauges in case my Bluetooth goes out again. And that's pretty much it. So now you know how to install a fuel gauge and a temperature gauge. So hope you guys enjoyed this install. Catch you guys next time. See you later.